So remember, he was writing back to this rabbi. David Tzvi Hoffman is writing back to this rabbi who said to him, the people want an organ. What am I going to do? They're going to fire me. So he talked about it from a lot of different perspectives. So far, he's been pretty negative on the organ. He addressed the organ in Prague. There's some reasons why it might have been in Prague, but it doesn't mean that you can necessarily adapt it to us doing it. Whether it was similar to the one in the tabernacle and whether that's even a good argument. And then the question of, is it walking in the way of the non-Jew? What's considered walking in the way of the non-Jew? Is it just something that is idolatrous, or is it anything that's a way that they specifically conduct themselves with no other reason, but that it identifies, but that it's about who they are, and doing what they do is a way of imitating them. And so he kind of ends that section with, we see that according to all the opinions, an organ is forbidden biblically, he says, because of because of walking in their ways. Now, that would not mean just on Shabbat. That would mean on weekdays also. Now, he's saying that that's according to everybody, but we know that's not necessarily according to everybody. There were those who committed it today. And it seems like in Prague, maybe they even had a non-Jew played on Shabbat. Obviously, a lot has to do with the historical context, what it means in the 1600s, different than what it means in the late 1900s. Then he has a section on Ha'argel, the organ, not just walking in the way of the non-Jew, which the Torah mentions, but no, one issue is it walking in the way of the non-Jew? But let's say it's actually not that. Let's say that you determine that it's a normal thing to play an organ. It's a way of bringing honor. And like the Marik said, it has a logical reason why you're doing it. It doesn't mean that you're imitating the non-Jew. But what about imitating the Reform? Maybe that's a separate problem. Maybe that's forbidden. Even if it doesn't fall under that category of a v'chukoteim, let's say, walking away with non-Jew, something idolatrous. So you don't hold, let's say that they only hold it applies to idol worship, and maybe hold Christianity is not idolatry, but it is what the Reform do, and the Reform do it as a sign of being Reform. So maybe that is a problem. Chukot ha'apokorsim, the going in the way of the heretic. It says, we see in the Gemara in Chulin, on Mem Aleph Amud Aleph, there was an issue of the Sadducees used to sacrifice, when they sacrificed an animal, or when they slaughtered an animal. When you slaughter an animal, you have to cover the blood with dirt. You put dirt on the ground, the blood falls on it, you cover it with dirt. Certain kinds of animals. The Sadducees apparently had a hole in the ground, and they would slaughter the animal. They didn't do it the way we do it. They had a hole in the ground, and they would slaughter it so the blood went into the hole in the ground. So the question in the Gemara is, can you do that? So the Gemara says you could do that in your house. Now, if you're doing it, you're not doing it because you're a Sadducee, you're doing it because it's more convenient. So you could do it in your house. But uveshuk, in the marketplace, you should not slaughter in that manner. The blood goes into because it's going to look like you're strengthening or identifying with the minim, with the Jewish heretics. You're strengthening the hand of the Sadducees in this place. The Gemara says there, it says that you shouldn't do it in the marketplace, slaughtering into a hole in the ground, because, as it says in the Torah, don't go in their ways. Now, usually that refers to the way of the non-Jew. And if someone does it, you have to check, are they trustable? Are they a Sadducee? So you see that wasn't necessarily the non-Jew who did it, that was the Jewish heretics. And even so, that was part of, the Gemara says, that's part of walking in the way of the non-Jew. So he says this would be true of an organ also, that an organ should be forbidden because of even if you say it's not going in the way of the non-Jew, because either it's something normal that the non-Jew does, or the non-Jew, in this case the Christian, is not an idolater. But you see in the Gemara that the Sadducees, that imitating the Sadducees and strengthening their practice was considered part of not walking in the way of the non-Jew. So over here also by the organ, strengthening the reform custom of playing an organ should be problematic as part of the overall category of going in the way of the other. Gemara is true, it's talking about a non-Jew, but this would even be part of it. Because you're strengthening the klukot, the custom of those who are either non-Jews or Arabs. He says, look, why is it that the Reform play the organ? They play the organ because they're trying to break open the gates of Judaism. That is true. They desecrate the Shabbos publicly. They change the prayers. They deny the coming of the Messiah. And they're playing the organ as a symbol of who they are. Even in the face of the rabbis who tell them, the Orthodox rabbis, they tell them not to. And now if I permit an organ to be played in an Orthodox synagogue, the Reform are going to say, look, the Orthodox are playing an organ. They're supporting us. Rabbi David Tzvi Hoffman is a supporter of organs in synagogues. Maybe he agrees that it's fine to be reformed. So we can see that's not crazy. And before you know it, we're all, basically it's a slippery slope. The Orthodox are going to permit other things the Reform do, and it's a slippery slope. In ruach ha'et sovaltan, because this is not something that's just a one-time thing. This is the ruach ha'et. This is the spirit of the time. This is the enlightenment. V'emet ha'nisayon me'id sha'a nasiyon me'id sha'am lo yasfiku beheter ma'at ki moshchim ha'avon befeble shav. The people don't just want an organ. People who want an organ want to be part of the enlightenment. That's what he's saying. So you can see what he's saying. It's not just a technical question of can you play an organ. The much bigger question, this reminds me so much of Moshe writing in the 50s, when Orthodox synagogues, one by one, were taking down the mechitzas and becoming conservative. So you had the traditional synagogues in which they had half a mechitza, half not a mechitza. But you see that it's like it's not just a mechitza question. It's a question of are we modernizing? That's the question. And of course that does often the slippery slope. Neil Sharish Parosh Vala, it plants a root, la vera of sin, vera, and it's a slippery slope. One sin causes another. Hiloya Richu Hayamim, Vilaragel Argal, Kol Mikilot, Nashim, Shirot, Nishma Bechel Hashem. If you're going to play an organ, very soon you're going to have female choirs singing in the shul. The Seder HaTfila, Shekibalnu Be'avotenu, Nifritza, Pirtza, Achar Pirtza. And you can be sure, he says, they're going to start changing the prayer service. Neres Shtusa Avoda Shebelev Ayidei Hosafa Vikaron Ayidei Shinuyim B'Chalufim. Start changing things. Kikafu Amaharsim Avat Hashem Ayidei Yav. They deny the messianic idea. So he says, this is very interesting. He says, therefore, in our time, it's more forbidden today in the late 19th century, he says, than it was before. Because this is the sign of Reformation. And of those who are heretics. He says you can be sure that you are strengthening their hands by playing an organ in an Orthodox synagogue, and then we're on our way to reform. Right? This is This is also a very current question. For instance, right now, Kesher Israel is going to very soon launch a search for a female um, position. And the reality is that that job is going to be very similar to my job. There's a very big question on the table in the shul, which is what's her title? Is it going to be Rabbah? Is it going to be Rabbanit? Is it going to be, director of education? Is it going to be community leader? Is it going to be spiritual leader? And it sounds like very minor arguments, but it's enormous because, right, it's a fear of, it's not that there's any problem with a woman, teaching Torah and speaking, certainly, speaking from the pulpit, guiding people, visiting the sick, and, doing, 99% of what I do. But it's all right. It's the same issue. In other words, this is are we then? Is it the slippery slope to conservative reform? If there had been no conservative reform movement, it would be a much easier question, right? The same thing with the organ. Had there been no reform movement, I have no doubt that Rabbi David Tzvi Hoffman would have a much less problem with having an organ in an Orthodox shul. He's very clear. That makes a lot of sense. And so that's the right. I mean, it's partly what makes Orthodoxy what it is, which is that things do change, but they change in very organic and democratic ways. There isn't just a word from on high that can change everything. It's not really a movement. Things do change. It's very much an evolutionary process. And you see women now, even in the Haredi community, women are educated in a totally different way than they were 100 years ago. Well, we read about that, the struggle for women's education in Krakow, in which it eventually had the absurdity that women were being educated in colleges, but they knew nothing about Judaism. So they were leaving Judaism in droves in Krakow in the 18th. Once people, that's how it happens. And then, of course, there was in Germany, they already had schools for women. But then he writes, he says there is a separate issue that you might be worried about, which is you can't play instruments. The Gemara does say that after the destruction of the temple, today we do, and we certainly do it in the context of praising God. But it's actually problematic. Like Rav Moshe writes, whether you can listen to play an instrument during 3 weeks, he says, really, you're never allowed to play an instrument. So he says, certainly during the 3 weeks we should. It's because of destruction. So he says, Shlomo Zalman Cohen writes, the Israelites, there's a newspaper, the Israelite, Haratov B'tam Das Shekami Shemit Onin, Babel Shalayim, Lo Yaval Lishmot Shir Hashem Alad Bechar. We shouldn't have music for the redemption, Bamativim, Levavam B'Shira Argal, Ramasu Bagola, and those who play the organ in a shul, they deny that there's going to be the emancipation, Ilahem Haga'ula. They think, this is an interesting thing, the emancipation, they see as the true redemption. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. That's interesting. Right? They saw he's saying on some level, they saw the European Enlightenment as the redemption of the Jewish people, the Messianic movement. That's why they took out all the things in the prayer. I didn't realize that the Reform already needed on this, but we took out and made all the things in the prayer service about Jerusalem and the redemption design. That's not why I'm forbidding organ. There's a separate question about what about permitting it at weddings and for the honor of the king. Remember, that was the two things that came up before in the halachic literature: weddings and the king's birthday. That seems to be like the things that you can't do away with. And he says, I did permit them to play the organ at a wedding. And I permitted to play it for the honor of the king on his birthday. He says, but if you fear heaven, it seems like he's saying you shouldn't play the organ even at a wedding or his birthday. You should play other instruments. He's not forbidding instruments. He's forbidding the organ because of its association with form. Of course, because of its association with Christians and with the Reform, you should not play the organ. So in the end, he says it's forbidden. And he says it should be forbidden even on a weekday. That was the rabbi's original question. And I saw in the book on halakha that in terms of music in the shul, the same thing. And they put some other sources. Mihu im rav echad maunas umeducha yitaka atzmo lidvar halacha lahatir et ha'argal lachatunot of hamelech asher samach atzmo al k'tasam atirim shloso Shabbos. If he says other rabbis say that you could have an organ on a weekday at a wedding or at the birthday of the king, then he says it's removed. It's because that's for the honor of the bride and groom. It's not like being like the form. It's not davening. And you can rely on those permissions. Rely on those leniencies if you want to for a wedding or he says, this sin alone, I would not. So remember, there was a rule, he said, that when you got your smicha, when you got your ordination from the Hildesheimer Seminary, you were told you cannot have a shul. Now, he does say here, just this sin alone, I wouldn't take away somebody's smicha. I wouldn't take away my student's smicha. But he would have to argue publicly how he's permitting. That it doesn't become a slippery slope. Oppenheim says, after I wrote this, I saw David Oppenheim writes about it. Those in 1865 from Hamburg said it was forbidden. And there is a tshuva, he says, of Rabbi David Fredo, who's much earlier, who permitted it on Simchas Torah, but that was only with not an organ. And then we'll do the next two paragraphs later, but in the next two paragraphs, he's sort of stuck with the question of what about this rabbi's parnasa? What about, this poor rabbi? He's going to be kicked out of his shul for this. He does not permit it based on that, but he does say, before I make this decision, it's such a big decision, and it's going to affect this rabbi's, position in the synagogue. I want to ask 5 other rabbis. He does. It'll be interesting who he asks. Okay. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you. Good day.
Thank you.